All right, well, thank you, Sarah. Welcome everybody to our afternoon session on the CAISO NRI process. So I'm hoping most of you were able to join us for our morning session, but as a quick recap of what we've talked about so far, we had a good 2-hour session this morning where we walked through CAISO readiness from the perspective of when you want to start the new resource implementation process. So we talked about what it takes to get into the CAISO full network model. We talked about metering requirements. We talked about the requirements to achieve synchronization with CAISO. And so this presentation, or this portion of the presentation, is really just a continuation of that process. So we really stopped at bucket 4 of the NRI process. There are 6 buckets total, if you guys remember. So we're going to talk about buckets 5 and 6 today. And just some considerations around once your site is in the test energy phase, what you need to know, anything related to how that commissioning schedule that you're working through with your site team needs to be communicated to CAISO. So we'll go into that today. We'll also spend a few minutes talking about the options around commercial operation that are available to you. There are 2, so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So hopefully everybody has already gotten their feet wet with all this CAISO jargon, and but if there's anything acronym wise that you don't understand, or if I'm using a term that you're not familiar with, please don't hesitate to type it into the chat, and Sarah will stop me and we can take a moment and address that, because I actually believe definitions are really important. And we actually are going to talk about the definition of COD in this presentation as well, because I think there's quite a few conflicting definitions around that really just need to be fleshed out a little bit further. So again, this is what we've talked about earlier today. So hopefully this is just the continuation of that. This session is scheduled to go until 3:30 today. We may not need that full time, so we'll kind of see how many questions come up at the end, but we'll get started. Okay, so again, just quick reorientation to where we are in the process. So we've gone through the CAISO sync approval process by this point. What that means is, as far as CAISO is concerned, we are in what is called sync OK status with CAISO. Now, just getting to sync OK status does not mean that you're automatically allowed to just start putting electricity on the grid to start commissioning your project. There's a process that needs to be followed that heavily involves your scheduling coordinator. So we'll talk about what that process looks like. But again, for those of you who may not have been on our earlier session today, sync approval, this process, once you've achieved all of our bucket 1 through 4 submittals, once you've successfully completed your CAISO point-to-point testing, and once you've executed your regulatory contracts with CAISO, you can request synchronization from the CAISO team. Each of the various business units within CAISO will review your request and approve it. And then once they've all approved it, there will be an email that comes out that's generated by CAISO that says, your resource has been approved for synchronization. Please have your scheduling coordinator submit test energy schedules so that you can start using grid power for commissioning purposes. So that's where we're at in the process. So as I mentioned, just having sync OK does not mean you just get to automatically start using grid power. So one of the things that we really try to highlight for our resource owners that we work with is making sure we're communicating and coordinating with the scheduling coordinator on a weekly basis to submit accurate test energy schedules. This is a sample test energy schedule. It is not complicated. A lot of scheduling coordinators will have their own version of this document, and it really is just intended to reflect at the resource ID level, so keep that in mind. At the resource ID level, how many megawatts of test energy we are scheduling and during a given time period. So that includes negative megawatts, which would represent megawatts of charging energy that we'll be taking from the grid, for example, if we're commissioning a battery. So these schedules are required to be submitted on a weekly basis by your scheduling coordinator. They have a process that they have to follow. It's called Ops Procedure 5320. By which these schedules are communicated to CAISO. And as the resource goes through hot commissioning, these schedules will need to be submitted until the resource achieves commercial operation. So you may start out with this test energy schedule that's only has, oh, I need 10 megawatts, today, or 5 megawatts today. But as you, move through that commissioning phase of your project, you're going to be adding commissioning megawatts to this schedule in alignment with what your site team is commissioning. There's a really important timing aspect to this and lesson learned that I feel like it would be really valuable to share with all of you. So we've worked with a lot of resources. We've worked with a lot of different types of resources. One thing that always tends to come up is curtailments. So it's important to keep in mind that if you are a resource that is in test energy only, you are not yet commercial, test energy is typically the first to be curtailed if CAISO needs to reduce congestion on the grid. It's also the first to be curtailed if you're a battery trying to take power off the grid during high need periods. So what does that mean for you? Well, it means if you're commissioning a project and your schedule is requiring that you are in the test energy phase during the hottest months of the year, you need to be prepared to work alternate work schedules or to schedule your commissioning team on alternate work schedules. What does that mean? It means working outside of peak hours. It means making sure that you can do night work potentially in order to mitigate that. So it's just, unfortunately, it's something that we've seen quite a few resources have to deal with in the past few years as more and more renewables come online. There's just more and more curtailments that are happening because either the grid is already, at capacity and cannot take additional generation, or they don't want to take any power off the grid because that's power that's needed at that time. So something just to keep in mind when you're going over that schedule with your commissioning team. Okay, so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about COD, commercial operations prerequisites. So we'll talk about buckets 5 and 6. We'll go through the 72-hour telemetry check, which is really the only test. Say this loud for the people in the back. This is the only test that CAISO requires aside from the point-to-point test for commercial operation. You have to have 72 hours of clean real-time telemetry. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about the commercial operations for market, or COM, approval process, which is an alternate path to achieving partial commercial operation for your project. So what is the COM process? What does this mean? So commercial operations for market is effectively the exact same from a market perspective. It's the exact same status as being COD. The only difference is if you are in a COM status, it means that your resource has not achieved full build out and full PMAX capability of that specific resource. So I'll use some real numbers for y'all to hopefully illustrate this point. Say you have a 100 megawatt solar PV facility and you are commissioning it in phases, and you want to bring on, say, 50 megawatts of that electricity and generation capability before the entire build out is completed, because maybe you have delays in equipment, maybe you have curtailment issues, maybe you have construction stuff that happens, right? There's always a reason for projects to get delayed. You can exercise your ability to go COM instead of COD for that 50 megawatts. Why would you want to do that? Well, there's a couple different benefits to you as the resource owner. It allows you to start the process for applying for net qualifying capacity, NQC, for that 50 megawatts. So you can do that early. A lot of folks are looking at this as an option because we all know that, for batteries specifically, resource adequacy, being on an NQC list is very, very important. So if for whatever reason you can get through 50 megawatts, but you're going to be delayed in getting the last 50 done, you can go commercial with the first 50 using this process. It's also an option for if you have phases represented in your project. So if you look at your interconnection agreement in Appendix C, I believe they have listed out if you have formal phases identified in that project, they would be represented with a capital P phase, or if you have just large interconnection with no phasing identified, you could still exercise this option as well. So you can do it either with formal phasing or with informal construction sequencing based phasing. What is required to do this? You have to submit a plan to CAISO. We recommend that you submit this to them in bucket 5-ish of the NRI process. So we would want to identify this with you around that time frame. There's a very simple formatted document that we'll look at in another slide here about what does that look like. That plan gets submitted to CAISO. It outlines what is your anticipated schedule for when you intend to bring on the full megawatts for this resource. And it also requires, unfortunately, more letters and more steps of approval of those letters as you go through that process. So your PTO, your participating transmission owner, may not be able to or not want to give you a COM approval letter for partial megawatts, but they may do that for you too. So they may allow you to either have the full megawatts available under their PTO letter, or they may give you partial COM megawatts as well. So we would upload that letter as a COM approval letter in bucket 6 of the NRI process. Already talked about NQC. The COM approval process will mirror the CAISO COD process. So you'll essentially go through the same process twice, requesting COM and then again requesting COD. And your scheduling coordinator would manage that difference in your anticipated PMAX for the resource and what COM megawatts you're bringing online via outage tickets. And that's, again, that ops procedure. This is 5330. So it's a process that they are involved in to basically derate the resource from that, say the PMAX is 100 megawatts to 50 until you're able to reach that full 100 megawatts. So this is a sample COM plan. It's not very complicated at all. So again, this is really coordinated with your construction team and will be up to the construction sequencing of the site, how it's going to be built out over time. So we would need to provide the plan of when each phase of the project is going to be brought on commercially. We would put those dates in this plan and submit it to CAISO for their review and approval. The good news about this plan is that we can always update it, so it doesn't have to be an exact science. It just gives CAISO a view into when we think those megawatts are going to be available commercially. So it's the best information we have at the time is what we use to complete this document. And if it needs to be updated at a later date or as we move through the construction process, we update it with CAISO and we're able to keep it as a living document as we move through that process. The other thing to note here, I mentioned telemetry testing. If a resource is exercising the COM option, you do not need to go through 72-hour telemetry testing for each COM phase that's being brought on. You only go through it the first time. So you go through it once, and then the remaining phases of the project, you don't go through that same telemetry check over and over again. And again, this is just more information about how that COM process works, how the scheduling coordinator is involved in that process. So again, the scheduling coordinator would essentially be submitting outage tickets for the PMAX of the resource as you're going through that COM process. You have to submit a COM declaration letter via RIMS, which is the Resource Interconnection Management System that my team uses to communicate with CAISO. All new resources go through this process, use that system. It's instead of a COD declaration, it's a COM declaration letter. It's a similar template for each incremental portion of megawatts that you're bringing online commercially. And that if there are any changes, again, like I mentioned in the COM plan, we would just upload a revised version to CAISO for their approval. Okay, so regardless of whether you're going the COM route or the COD route, we also have to get through, as a prerequisite to COD, we have to get through bucket 5 of the CAISO NRI process. Bucket 5 has essentially 2 submittals. The first is the final control and protection relay settings and field test reports for each of those control and protection relays. They are not factory acceptance test reports, they are field reports. So this is essentially intended to let CAISO know what is the end state of the resource from a control and protection perspective. How has the it's the as left settings for that resource. So we would submit those in bucket 5 of the NRI process, along with if the CAISO is a CAISO metered, if the resource is a CAISO metered entity, we also need to provide meter site verification sheets and potentially point of receipt calculation documentation that support the programmed losses that are represented in that meter site verification sheet. So again, going back to the presentation from this morning, if your resource is scheduling coordinator metered, an SCME resource, and you do not have meters that are pulled directly by CAISO and validated by CAISO and sealed by CAISO, you do not need to provide this meter documentation in bucket 5. You just will have no metering requirements at this phase of the project. So the only submittal, if you're an SCME, that you'll need to do in bucket 5 is the final control and protection relay settings and field test reports. For the ISOME projects, this submittal is critical from a timing perspective. It is one of the most challenging submittals that we handle. And the reason being is there's a lot of different hands that go into approving this document. So as a level set, like we talked about in the first session today, all of those meters that are CAISO meters have to be sealed by a CAISO certified meter inspector once they've been validated through ops procedure, I believe it's 5710, that the CAISO meter inspector has to go through. Normally this happens during the point-to-point test with CAISO. So there'll be a rig portion of that test, and then there will be a metering portion of that test where the meters will be validated as well if we're a CAISO metered entity. Once those meters are sealed, this document, this meter site verification sheet, is CAISO's artifact and record of the end state of that meter the last time it was touched. So this is a really vital piece of information for CAISO, again, because they're responsible for directly polling and settling those meters. They want to know how that meter was left when the meter inspector inspected it and CAISO sealed it and locked it down. So what makes this also challenging is that it is a document that requires 4 signatures once it's been validated by CAISO. So there are 4 folks that are listed on the bottom of this form. You will have the meter installer, and that can be, whoever was working on the project from the EPC contractor's perspective that just put the meter in the socket, okay, meter installer. There is a meter programmer who actually wrote the programming and programmed it into that meter. There's the CAISO certified meter inspector. That inspector will have a an inspector ID number that will need to be listed on this form as well. So they're the 3rd signature. And then there will be a 4th signature that is the resource owner. So who is representing the interconnection customer on behalf of this resource? That's the 4th signature. What the process typically goes like is we get that meter site verification sheet, we review it for completeness, it gets uploaded to CAISO. CAISO has to validate it. If they validate it and all of the fields are filled out correctly and there's no errors, they issue a DocuSign request to the first signatory, and then it moves through the process and goes from the meter installer to the meter programmer to the meter inspector to the resource owner. So as you all can probably imagine, that is a somewhat time-intensive exercise. It requires folks who are paying attention and looking at their email to to see that request come through and not ignore it or assume it's spam, but actually respond to it and complete it. One of the biggest lessons learned that I have on this submittal is make sure that whoever's email you're putting on the bottom of that form, that person knows that they have a part to play in this last submittal. Unfortunately, what we find a lot of times is the meter installer, whoever did the initial install of that meter into the socket, perhaps they were working for the EPC contractor. At this point in the project, the EPC is pretty much done with all of their work, project substantially complete. They're just in punch list mode. So whoever that person was that got their name put on this form, they may or may not be engaged on this project anymore. So what we always recommend is, because there's no validation on that role in this form, it should be somebody who's still close to the project and who's still part of the project, whether that's the site foreman, somebody who's still there working on the site from the EPC's perspective, the site project manager, somebody who's going to be paying attention and looking for this. So that's a big one. The other lesson learned is on the owner's side of this. So we shouldn't be putting the CEO of your company as the signatory on these forms. It should be a representative of the owner's project management team who is aware of and paying attention to this submittal. So it seems silly, it seems like overkill, but really it's the kind of thing that can make or break a project timeline if we have 4 folks that we're counting on to get this submittal completed, and we end up waiting on one person who didn't even know that they were responsible for this. So just another kind of lesson learned that I think is important to share as we move through this. I'll say a quick word about POR calculation documents. So in the event that you have a project that is assessing losses in the meters, whether those are transformer losses or line losses, a point of receipt calculation document is required to be submitted with the MSVS form. In the MSVS form, there's a section that accounts for total percentage watt losses and total percentage bar losses. Both of those values need to be supported by a POR calc document. Most of the time, this is a big, massive Excel spreadsheet that the meter programmer puts together that accounts for all of those losses appropriately. And that is what we submit to CAISO. There will need to be one POR calc for each CAISO meter device and one MSVS form for each CAISO meter device. We have to have one for each. So if you have 6 CAISO meters on a project, you're going to have 6 MSVS forms and 6 POR calcs. So that's another important point to remember. Right. So we all know now about MSVS forms. Make sure that you know who's signing those things. Okay, bucket 6. I call this the phantom bucket because if you actually use the resource interconnection system that we use, there is no bucket 6 listed in that system. So you just have to know that it's required. This is your participating transmission owner COD approval letter. Similar to the PTO sync letter that we talked about way back in bucket 4, this is the approval letter that we receive once the PTO has confirmed that you've completed all of their prerequisites for commercial operation. What are those things? Well, the letter has to clearly state that the PTO has given permission to commence commercial operation for the megawatts that we want to declare commercial. So again, if we are using the COM process, it may be less than the full POI megawatts capacity of the resource, but it's what the utility is giving permission to go commercial for. There cannot be any restrictions or limitations or conditions on megawatt output in that letter. Otherwise, you're going to need to have a comp plan in place. So if you get a PTO letter that says, we, the utility, are going to allow you to, have commercial operation for 50 megawatts on a 100 megawatt resource, we need to submit a comp plan that shows we're only bringing on 50 megawatts at this time with this letter. We would then need to go back to the utility to get another letter from them for the additional 50 megawatts so that we have permission for the full 100 megawatts capacity. The letter can look exactly the same as the PTO sync letter in bucket 4, as long as it has all of the required verbiage. And, oops, sorry guys, I jumped over the telemetry check. The other thing that's important to remember on that letter is they will not issue it until the resource has completed all of their agreements and has them all executed. This includes retail power agreements. So this is something we run into quite often, unfortunately, on projects where they've got all their revenue metering set up, but they may not have their retail power agreements set up with that utility. So there are kind of two parallel items that need to be completed in order for the utility to give you this letter. They need to know that their retail metering is in place as well as the revenue metering. Prerequisites for this letter, again, not too dissimilar to what we'd be looking for from a sync letter, but all contracts have to be executed in place, including retail agreements, like I just mentioned. All testing and inspections that they require need to be completed. You will need to complete any RTU testing with their utility team. So that's another requirement that's different from CAISO point-to-point testing, but the utility will essentially have their own version of point-to-point testing with their RTU at the site as well. And all other outstanding issues, right-of-way, insurance, operating agreements, all of that has been resolved with the PTO. So this is them saying, you've met all those requirements and we're giving you permission to go commercial. So after we have that letter, we upload it to CAISO. Well, we review it first. Upload it to CAISO, and they have 10 days to review it. They usually don't take 10 days for PTO COD approval letters, but a general rule of thumb is they have 10 days to review it. If they accept it, then we move forward and we request COD from CAISO. The first thing that's going to happen once we request COD from CAISO is they're going to start their 72-hour telemetry check. This is a huge hurdle for every resource that we work on. It is the biggest hurdle for resources achieving COD in a timely manner is stable telemetry for 72 hours. What does stable telemetry mean? It means you cannot have any communication drops or failures. So you have to have, a consistent communication path to CAISO. You cannot have any of the CAISO real-time data in bad quality. So all of those real-time telemetry points that CAISO wants to see need to be coming in correct scaling and in good quality for the full 72 hours. And you have to hold it for that period of time. CAISO will communicate during this period. They will send out emails from their EDAS group, edas@CAISO.com, that will note if they are seeing any errors on their side during this telemetry test period. Very common issues, unfortunately, with this are simply poor communication infrastructure at the site. We have a lot of sites that we're using, potentially a wireless connection. That is not a best practice, and that's why we always recommend not just a primary IP address, but a backup IP address from a diverse communication path, so that if your primary fails, you can fail over to a backup IP on a different communication path, whether that's fiber, microwave, Starlink, whatever is available to you that has stability and can get your data from the site to CAISO. That's what we would recommend. That site communications is a really, really big one. Networking is another problem that we typically run into on this, where either the site network is not, the bandwidth on the site network is not sized appropriately, or you have some kind of internal networking problem that is impacting your CAISO real-time data. A lot of the times, the only information that we will get from CAISO during this period is a screenshot of what they see and what points they're seeing that are in bad quality. And then we have to go take that back to the resource owner, to the site team, and go essentially try to find that needle in a haystack, right? What is the root cause of this telemetry error flag that we're seeing? There are ways that the site can pull data the exact same way that CAISO pulls data. There's a software program that you can it's called Triangle MicroWorks, no free ads, but that's a program that we recommend to folks that you can download, and it will allow you to pull those telemetry points the exact same way CAISO is pulling them. So you can see where those errors might be coming from. It seems it isn't cheap. It's not a free program, but it is cheaper than a daily LD amount if you can't get to COD on time and you can't figure out why. All right. Again, like I mentioned, some other issues arise from potentially protocol misconfigurations, site construction and subsystem testing, generators or other power sources that are impacting power quality, and then just folks on the site not knowing that we're in a 72-hour test period. They may go back in, try to tweak something last minute or do some last minute programming. We have to really like nip that because that is another issue that typically derails our projects, is if somebody's not aware that this testing is going on, they're out there working on something and come to find out it's disrupted our 72 hours of clean telemetry. So that's another one that we see on a fairly regular basis. So yeah, site staff awareness, that's a big important one. Just again, to put the fear of God in folks on this, if we do not get 72 hours of clean telemetry the first time around, the process starts again. So you can see how quickly this could escalate and extend out your project schedule in a critical time frame, such as when you've requested COD and you're expecting a quick turnaround on that. If we cannot get through telemetry check, it will continue to go another 3 days, another 3 days, another 3 days until clean telemetry is made during that time period. Okay, so CAISO COD approval. Again, this process is supposed to take 5 business days if, big if, giant if, there are no telemetry issues. We are able to request COD from CAISO once we have buckets 1 through 6 accepted, which again, the last item is that PTO COD approval letter. All of these folks that I have highlighted here would be the groups that are reviewing our COD request. There's a couple more that are different from the groups that review our sync requests. So I'll just run through what they're looking for. So NRI, which is listed as MCI here on this the screenshot that I grabbed, they're reviewing all of our bucket submittals for completeness and acceptance. They are going to be the last approver now on NRI, I'm sorry, on our COD requests. That's a change that CAISO has made. And the reasoning behind this is that they want NRI to be the responsible party that is running around and chasing all of these other business units within CAISO and getting their approval before they approve. So they'll be the last to approve before the 2 Ops Readiness and Market Services Director approvals. The EDAS group, like I just mentioned, they are going to be conducting that 72-hour telemetry check. That's one of the items that they are going to be looking for before they approve our COD request. The other item that they're looking at, if you are a CAISO metered entity, is this certificate of compliance issuance. That documentation is intended to reflect that all of your meter documentation has been reviewed and is considered complete for your CAISO metering scheme. What documentation does that include? It includes a single line diagram, a 3-line diagram. It includes meter config forms. It includes a metering overview in some cases. It includes completed MSVS forms and a POR calc. So, and a COM block. So that's 7 documents that CAISO's EDAS team is going to re-review at the COD approval process stage of our project, confirm that everything is consistent from way back in bucket 1, which we may have submitted 10 months beforehand. They'll re-review all that documentation, and then they will issue it's a certificate of compliance PDF that gets emailed to the resource team that's listed on the project. So that will be an actual document that they send out that says that yes, your site has, you know, a CAISO certified metering scheme in place. The other groups that are reviewing, ops engineering, will confirm again that all grid contingencies have been met to ensure grid reliability once the resource has achieved commercial operation. Keep in mind that ops engineering only reviews ISO grid connected, so that would be transmission level connected resources that are over 10 megawatts. So if it's under 10 megawatts, ops engineering is not looking at it. And they do not look at two-party distribution connected resources either. Operational readiness, they have an internal check that they do. That's an independent internal check for the required real-time information for resources connected to the ISO controlled grid. Queue management, they will confirm that all three-party LGIA and SGIA requirements for commercial operation have been completed. And that the interconnection customer has a PTO COD approval letter that's been accepted by NRI. So this is a really important one. I'm gonna beat this one to death for a minute. If you have pending changes, amendments to your interconnection agreement, you will not get through CAISO COD approval until those agreements are final and have been executed. So that's a really important component of all of this. Is all contracts, including your interconnection agreement, have to be finalized and signed off before you can achieve commercial operation with CAISO. So this has held up and will hold up resource COD approval on other projects. So it's something to keep in mind. As I mentioned, the last group, once all those folks have reviewed and approved this request, the last group to approve would be the NRI team, followed by the two ops readiness and market services directors. They're always the last signatures that we get at the very end. So once all of these folks have approved our COD request, CAISO sends out, again, another email. It's nothing special. If you blink, you'll miss it. It's an email that notifies the project team that the project has been approved to declare COD. And then at that time, the resource owner needs to submit a COD declaration letter. This is a form letter that's included as an exhibit in your interconnection agreement that shows the effective date that the resource will be available in the commercial market. So it's Exhibit E of your interconnection agreement that will need to be completed and submitted to CAISO. Once we've gotten all the COD approvals done, they send out that email, we upload the letter, and then they send out, wait for it, another email. And that email will say that your COD as of this date when we submitted that commercial operation letter. And then you're finished. And then you're done with the CAISO NRI process once you get that second COD email. But what does COD mean? This is a question that I really, I think that folks have different ideas of what this means depending on what your role is on a project. So I think if y'all remember at the beginning of this, I said I like definitions, so we're going to spend some time looking at definitions. COD, I've found, means a lot of different things to a lot of different people that are involved on your project. If you're an EPC contractor, you think about COD as substantial completion. When have I finished all of the work to make this thing actually generate electricity? That's in their mind when we've achieved COD. CAISO COD. This is the date that CAISO is expecting you to be commercially available in the market. That's the date that you put on that letter. That's when they expect you to be a market participant. PPA COD. This is how your origination or development team sees COD. This is a date that they've agreed to in an interconnection, I'm sorry, in an offtake agreement that is their, drop dead date before LDs start, to get incurred on the project or penalties or whatnot. So everybody on a project has different definitions in their head of what commercial operation means. For CAISO's purposes, it is the date that you submit that letter. There is an expectation that you will be putting power onto the grid as of that date. So that is what their expectation is. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this call, the only testing that is required for you to get to that date with CAISO is a point-to-point check that happens before you synchronize to the grid, and that 72-hour telemetry check. From CAISO's perspective, those are the only two tests that they are going to require before they will approve COD. What the utility requires, any testing that they are going to need from you as the participating transmission owner, is outlined separately in their interconnection handbook, or their, if your PG needs, their G5 schedule. And those tests are completely separate from what CAISO cares about. So just keep that in mind. We get a lot of questions about what testing is required for CAISO COD. It's really just those two things from CAISO's perspective, but your utility partner, your participating transmission owner, is going to have additional testing requirements that you need to be aware of as well. We also get questions about what testing is required for meeting PPA obligations. That testing can happen after you've achieved commercial operations with CAISO. That is ancillary services testing typically. There is a testing protocol that your scheduling coordinator will help you to schedule to get that testing completed. And you can do that anytime after you have commercial operation and the site is at full capacity to perform that testing. So that may be a requirement for PPA COD. It is not a requirement for CAISO COD. So I think it was worth just spending a few minutes talking about those different definitions because everybody sees it as a different thing. Okay, so yeah, we didn't really talk too much about the COD declaration letter, but I'll spend a few minutes on this. So bucket 6, last item, like I said, is a COD declaration letter. It is that appendix, exhibit E in your LGIA or SGIA. This is the information that needs to be included on it. You have to have the resource ID, how many megawatts you're declaring commercial, the effective date, and signature of the resource owner. We recommend that this letter be submitted a day in advance of your target commercial operation date. It can be submitted same day. Usually if it's before noon Pacific, CAISO will work with us on doing same day declaration. The only issue with that is you would not be able to participate in the day ahead market if you have a same day commercial operation. So that's worth knowing as well. So I left a lot of time for questions on this one because I feel like there's always questions and we don't have to use up the whole time if we don't need it. But we're at the end of what I wanted to talk about today, but I'm happy to jump back to any slide that piqued anyone's interest or anyone has questions about. Really, this part of the process from a CAISO NRI standpoint is very much dependent on your construction schedule and also dependent on your participating transmission owner schedule. So if those two things are aligned, this goes really smoothly. However, if there are delays on either of those things, a lot of the times we see projects just sitting in test energy and submitting test energy schedules for a long time until those alignments can be made. So I saw a question come in, Sarah. I'm going to let you field those for me since I've got I think I've got the wrong screen up. So
yeah, no, that's great. So I will go ahead and give everyone hopefully the ability to unmute. So Divya, I know you posted a few questions. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, sure. Thank you. Thanks, Kelsey. Unfortunately, I had to miss the first 2 sessions, but hopefully I'll get to the, the recordings that will be sent later. So apologies if we've addressed any of this before. You talked about curtailment being, you're first on the list for curtailment if you're in that sync okay approval stage or while you're getting, going through that commissioning stage. Is there some sort of a notice that is provided beforehand so that you can plan, or is this something that is given like a day's notice? How does it work?
So your scheduling coordinator is going to be submitting test energy schedules to CAISO. CAISO will either accept or decline those test energy schedules or a portion of that test energy. They may, and timing wise, it really just depends on what they need for grid reliability. I would like to say they'd give you at least a day ahead notice if they're unable to accommodate that, because you are submitting those schedules on a weekly basis typically. So
okay.
yeah. So So they may just say, no, we're not doing any test energy this week, or they may say, well, we're going to allow you to have Monday, Tuesday, but Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we can't accommodate. So that's typically coordinated again with your scheduling coordinator. It's ops procedure 5320, I think, that they have to go through. I have to go back and look at my notes. But yeah, it is unfortunately kind of hard to predict. So.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Yeah, thank you. And then just to go back to the difference between the COM and the COD. So once you, are there different versions of the IA, or does the IA need to be amended if you're going with the COM?
No, so you have the option to exercise this option of COM if you are either, it just completely depends on whether you have phases identified formally in your interconnection agreement, or if you are using it for construction sequencing. You can use it in either case. So you don't have to have formalized phases in your interconnection agreement to exercise this, this option. You can use it again just for construction sequencing purposes only.
And in your experience, does that happen as I imagine if the project is already in pre-planned phases, then the original schedule accounts for that. But are there ad hoc changes is that what you mean when you say informal?
Right. So it happens if those phases are not formally planned for and accounted for in your construction schedule, and it's a consequence of, say you've got equipment delays, or you are being curtailed more than you imagined, and so you're only able to commission a percentage of the project at a time. We would look at this as an option for you to at least get some commercial megawatts available to start meeting your RA obligations. That's a big driver for this, Divya, is folks are looking for any way to accelerate the ability to get their resources on an NQC list with RA values associated with them, even if it's not the full value that they have contracted, even if it's partial.
Okay, understood. That makes sense. And lastly, maybe I missed this, but what happens in the event we fail the telemetry test? Does the 72-hour clock start again?
It does. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess I scared everybody with this, but I should probably also say if there is an outage. So for example, if you're on AT&T and they have an outage in your area, and you can point to documentation from AT&T that says we have a scheduled outage happening on this circuit on this day, and it impacted our resource, you can submit that information to CAISO, and a lot of times they will just discount that period of time that, oh, okay, we weren't expecting them to show generation values because their whole site was under a communications blackout, right? That was not their fault. So if there's instances like that during this telemetry check, you can communicate those to CAISO and they will work through that with you. But if it's truly an issue related to your site networking and how all these devices are communicating with one another, that's where you got to restart the test. So hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Kelsey.
Great, thanks, Divya. Riza, it looks like you have a couple questions. Would you like to unmute and ask?
Sure. So yeah, thank you for this presentation. Yeah, the first question I have is, you mentioned there's a program to check the 72-hour telemetry, like internally. What was the name of that program again? I missed that.
It's called Triangle Microworks, and I will put the name in the chat. So.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And the second question, if you could please provide some background information on the ancillary service testing, that would be great.
Yeah, so ancillary services testing is required typically by your power purchase agreement or your resource adequacy agreement, and it is coordinated between the site, CAISO, and your scheduling coordinator. And essentially what it is you want to do it when your resource is at like 100% capacity, so you can show real generation-based values during that testing period. And what that testing does is it certifies the resource for ancillary services at the levels that you test at. So those values get populated in your resource data template, your generator resource data template, after you've completed that testing. And each of the different testing protocols has like some specifics around it. I don't have it in front of me right now, Reza, but I could share that actual protocols document with you afterwards. But sometimes it's like you have to hold it for 4 hours. If it's a Pmax test, you have to show that you're able to push that Pmax value for 4 hours, and that is the testing that you would do to get that officially certified in your resource data template, so that the resource can actually participate in ancillary services, if that helps.
Yes. So sorry, does that mean like each phase has to show that full capacity, or the whole entire project?
I think it depends on how you have it contracted, Reza. So if normally we do it by resource ID. So it would be for that specific resource, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so it's by resource ID typically, and I don't think you'd want to do it in a partial manner. I think you'd want to have full capacity, just so that you don't have to retest once the site is fully built out, right? So that's why we always see folks doing it at the very end of a project or post CAISO COD, is because they don't want to have to do it multiple times. They want to do it once when they have the resource fully built out and can hit all those targets.
Got it. Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Great questions, everybody. I don't see any additional questions in chat. Oh, RC, looks like you have a question. Would you like to unmute and ask?
Sure, Kelsey and GridSME team, thank you so much for putting this together. You know, these information are somewhat opaque for everyone. So we're really glad that you guys are at the forefront of making all these clear. So we really appreciate that. My question is, in terms of revenue generation from the asset owner perspective, the revenue that comes in as we put in the test energy, how is that different from the revenue that's generated after CAISO COD?
It's a really good question, and I'm going to try to answer it, Ryan, even though I'm not really a market expert, so take it with a grain of salt. But you can get paid for test energy during that period. I've seen, unfortunately, some, depending on what your agreements are with your off-taker, sometimes they do not want that. They want all of that test energy to be allocated to the offtake agreement and not the asset owner. So I've seen that on some projects, Ryan, where they've just been restricted from actually making money on test energy because they have it written into their power purchase agreement or their resource adequacy agreement that the offtaker is the sole beneficiary of any power generated from the resource, and they don't make a differentiation between test energy and commercial energy. So that's one weird nuance that I've seen out there. As far as the difference in the price per megawatt that you would get, I really don't know that answer, Ryan. I just know that you'd probably be in the energy only space. If you're in test energy, you would not get paid for any like ancillary services or anything like that. It would be energy only during the test energy period.
Thank you. So, right. So as a follow-up, then when we schedule for a test energy, I guess we'll be able to make the energy arbitrage during the interim period, which is after the initial sync. Is that still available just the same as it will be available during CAISO COD? Let's say we don't have any PPA constraints. Just from the eyes of CAISO, is it the same kind of a revenue and scheduling that the asset owner will be able to do?
That's my understanding. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right.
So if there's no PPA constraints, Ryan, you're under the same auspices as if you were under commercial. But again, it's
Understood.
energy only in test energy
Sure.
phase. So
okay. Thank you.
Are there any additional questions?
Oh, I had too much time on this one, Sarah. Okay, I'm okay to stick around if folks want to ask any other questions, or again, if there's any other items that we went over on this presentation that you want a little bit more of an in-depth kind of view on, I'm happy to go backwards and take a look at that. Otherwise, you know, I think I put our email on here, nri@gridsme.com, which you can always reach out to us there if you have questions. Our team is very helpful, and we're happy to share this information with you if you have additional, you know, additional follow-up questions for us. And this will be provided, like Sarah said, next week as a recording as well.
Yeah. Sorry, Kelsey. I do have one question. One more question actually. So, just as far as the schedule of kind of like the business hours or business days for CAISO goes, do they work on like kind of like 7 days a week schedule?
No, no, that's a good question. They work 5 days a week, and so usually I think I mean the NRI team is around 8 to 5 standard hours. I think the EDOS team, they have, it depends on if they have like point-to-point testing, but I want to say they're like 7:30 to 5:30. So unfortunately, they don't work weekends. And what that means for telemetry testing, we've seen, unfortunately, they'll send out maybe a notice on a Friday afternoon, late on a Friday afternoon, that they're seeing these telemetry errors. That gets communicated to an email distribution list that may or may not include the site team. So it may take a couple hours for that information to filter down to the site. The site would address that. You'd wait the whole weekend to see if what you did addressed the problem, because they are evaluating telemetry over the weekend. So keep that in mind. They are looking at that real-time data when they come back on Monday. But if you get notice from them on a Friday, you're not going to hear from them again until Monday at the earliest, if that, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
They're real-time operations. They're there all the time, but they're not during this period when we're going through telemetry check. That's not communicated through them. It's all through EDOS.
Thank you.
Great questions. Are there any further questions?
I understand the focus on CAISO and the context, but are you guys planning to have similar sessions that would in the future maybe cover some of the other markets?
I think that's a great question. So I'll be very transparent with you all. My team primarily works in CAISO because it's such a convoluted process. A lot of the other ISOs are a little bit more straightforward. So we add less value, I guess I'll say, in that situation. But Divya, we are working actively in SPP, in MISO, in ERCOT, and a few other markets. PJM is another one we've started working in. So we're trying to kind of establish a similar level of expertise and protocol in those ISOs. And once we have that, I think we could definitely do this type of training. That's just my team. I know our engineering team works across the whole country and out of the country actually as well. So they may be able to provide more insight into their scopes outside of CAISO.
Understood. Thank you. Thank you for this series. Really liking it. Thank you.
Glad you're enjoying it.